Good morning, council. Please
May
state
it
your
please the
appearance.
court, Attorney Peter Angelis. I represent Amica Mutual Insurance Company. Where would we all be if we didn't have Michigan no-fault litigation? You'd think
Today we wouldn't have any interesting cases, I can tell you that.
45
We
years
have
of
a
statute's
fair
been
share
out
of them.
since 1982.
I want the photograph case.
And we're still trying to figure this out. You know, I'm not going to try to represent that this is an interesting case, but it's an important case to the litigants involved in the
This is
case.
grandparent.
And this is the grandparent case. I represent the Amica grandparents, and we have the Progressive grandparents, and Farmers has the assigned claims facility.
His
So,
grandparents never thought they'd end up at court on a case like this.
yeah. So the other thing that I'm thankful for in terms of having business is that, you know, there's no way AI is going to be able to figure this stuff out. You know, the facts are to determine this coverage, these coverage issues, it's so fact specific. You know, I get a kick out of when the adjusters call and can you just tell me informally what the priority is? And I'm pulling out my cheat sheets, and there's no easy answer to these questions, but the facts. Yeah.
Can you share your cheat sheets?
I was gonna say.
I still have them. I still have them
Attach
in
it
the
to
drawer.
something and file it with the court.
You know, so this case is like a lot of these cases, very fact specific. It addresses the issue. It's asking the Court of Appeals to address the issue. What is a domicile? And we're looking at section 3114 of the no fault statute. And the facts were essentially uncontested at the time. You know, the motor vehicle accident involving Mr. Jones occurred in February of 2021. He was uninsured at the time. He was just temporarily driving his grandfather's vehicle, so he did not have his own no-fault coverage. He had already moved out of his Amica grandparents' home and moved into the Progressive grandparents' home
During COVID, right?
during COVID for 6 months because his Amica grandparents were worried about, you know, COVID and Desmond, you know, like young people do, are in and out, and apparently they're compromised and they were worried. And he moved into the Progressive grandparents' home, started paying rent, moved all of his stuff there, and testified unequivocally that he had no intention of returning to the Amica grandparents' home because they wanted him out. His intention was to save money and go to work.
But he still had some connection to that.
The connection was a TV was left there, and I believe he left his driver's license at his grandparents' home. Those are the only two items.
Get his mail there?
Some of the mail, one of the I don't know which I think it was a Progressive grandmother stated that he was getting mail at her home, but I'm sure he probably was getting some mail at the Amica grandparents' home as well.
Maybe we have to go down the Dairyland Workman factors here and then.
Right, exactly,
It's,
exactly.
And you guys have briefed that extremely well.
Right, but so that's the domicile issue. The other thing is the Amica policy provides coverage for family members. He didn't meet that definition because he wasn't residing at the home at the time. So we have an argument that I've raised in our brief that an insurance policy is just like any other contract, and absent a public policy consideration, it should be interpreted just like any other contract based on the clear and unambiguous terms of the policy. So that was another argument that I'd like to raise. And finally, it was curious to me that none of the other litigants in the trial court made the assertion that Amica was the stuckee on this case. Progressive denied coverage on the basis that, in fact, he was a resident relative in the Progressive household, and the Progressive insured failed to disclose that fact. So they're denying coverage on an issue that had nothing to do with domicile. They didn't raise that issue. So that issue was not preserved below. So, you know, the seminal case is Grange versus Lawrence. It's really, and the Workman criteria, it's really a totality of the circumstances, not one situation controls. But in this case, the overwhelming testimony is, and the quote was that the testimony from the Amica grandfather was that he told me he wasn't allowed to go back to his grandfather's house. And I'm sorry, that was from the Progressive grandmother, said that Mr. Jones, the grandson, was not allowed to go back to his grandfather's house, which was the Amica household, and that even his mother sent me a text that was the case. And then I asked Mr. Jones whether he planned to go back, and he unequivocally said, no, I didn't plan to go back. He was paying rent at the Progressive home. He was planning to save money and start his own domicile into the future.
But he did go back though, right?
He did go back home but that the time frame for analyzing the domicile issue is at the time of the accident. Otherwise, we'd have people going back to their parents and grandparents' home after the accident, when they hadn't, when they don't, oh, I don't have insurance. Maybe I'll go move in with mom and dad or grandmother and grandfather. It's at the time of the accident. What was his intent? At the time of this accident, his intent was never to return back to his Amica grandparents' home because they were concerned for their safety. They didn't want him in the home, and he had already set up his residence. Kids don't use the word domicile, but his residence with his progressive grandparents, paying rent there with the intention of moving forward. The reason he went back to the Amica grandparents' home is because he was severely injured in this accident, and he came back, and his Amica grandfather became his medical guardian to make medical decisions because he was seriously injured. So it's not what he could have done or what he could have done. He testified also that, I was planning to stay. If it hadn't been for COVID, I was going to stay with the Amica grandparents, but COVID happened and he moved out. The fact that he could have stayed or the fact that he returned back to stay, I do not think are controlling facts, because it is what he did. His stated intent was never to come back. The reason he came back was fortuitous based upon the motor vehicle accident happening. So that was after the fact. After the motor vehicle accident, he decided to come back. The time in which the court should make its determination, the analysis should be at the time of the motor vehicle accident, what was his domicile at that time? At that time, the preponderance of the evidence is that the domicile was with the progressive grandparents for all the reasons I stated, and there was sworn testimony to support that. And I really don't have anything else to add. I'd reserve the balance of my time.
Okay. Thank you.
Morning, Your Honors. Jeffrey Murray on behalf of FLE Progressive. To Judge Riordan's point, I believe that this is really a dairyman and workman factors analysis. But before, and I'm not going to go through all 9 of them, but before you get there, you really have to focus on the most important factors laid out in Grange, which is intent. And that really requires a greater context here. We're talking about a young man who lost his father when he was 11 years old, decade before the subject accident. His mother was severely disabled as a result of that same earlier accident. And then he moves in with his grandparents, and they function to the extent the mother's not able to, like his parents. So now you jump forward, he's 18, 19 years old, and has the intention of moving out permanently, like most 18 or 19-year-olds do. But then you get COVID. And COVID is really the hiccup here. It's the thing that pulls this analysis out a little bit because it's such an unusual but temporary circumstance. But for COVID, he wouldn't have moved in with Progressive's insured. He probably would have stayed with his original family until he was able to move out with his friends, as was his stated intention. That means that his residence with the Progressive grandparents was a temporary resident, but it wasn't his domicile. His domicile remained at the home that he had grown up in with the people who had raised him until just very recently. And that's not only his testimony, but it's also demonstrated after the fact by when he gets hurt, when he needs to recover, where does he go? He goes home to his grandparents. He goes home to his mom. That's not unlike a college student who might have multiple residences, a dorm, and his parents' house. But when you go home, when you need to go home for the holidays, or maybe you get sick, you go back to mom and dad. And so we think that this case is much more analogous to the stated Gilmore case that's referenced in our brief, where you look to the totality of the factors and what it says to intent. And that's really what controls here. I'll add, on balance, I think that the workman and dairy factors also favor finding domicile with the Amica insureds, but I'll leave that for the briefs, unless there's any other questions.
Questions? No questions. Thank you.
Good morning, Your Honors. Dave Perangelo here on behalf of farmers. And I really don't have anything to add. because this is more of a domicile issue unless you have any specific questions of me.
I don't have any questions.
Thanks for coming.
Okay, thank you.
I disagree that this was a temporary arrangement. I asked Desmond Jones, the injured party, when this accident happened, were you planning on returning back to the Gilbert residence, which is the Amica residence? Answer, no. This is also a case that's distinguishable from the estate of Gilmore case, which was unpublished. I did get a copy of it. In that case, it was there were students going back and forth, and they ended up back at their parents' house. And also, I just want to emphasize that analysis is not to be from the prospective point of view, after what could have happened after the accident. The analysis should be at the time of the accident. At the time of the accident, he had moved out of the house. He was not permitted to come back to the house, didn't plan to come back to the house. And he did a bunch of other things under the various standards we've been talking about to indicate that his domicile was with the progressive grandparents. I thank you for your time. And,
Thank you. Thank
good
you
luck
both,
with this one.
counsel.
Have a good day.
Have a great day.
Take care.
That case will be submitted.